December 23rd, 1944. Ardennes Forest, Belgium. The evacuation order was clear. All personnel fall back immediately. German forces advancing in strength. Defensive line compromised. Retreat to secondary positions. Corporal James Brennan sat in the communications bunker, reading the order for the third time, trying to make sense of what it was asking him to do. Evacuate. Leave. Get out before the Germans arrived. Standard procedure. Tactically sound. But impossible. Not physically impossible. Brennan could leave, could pack his gear, walk out the door, follow the rest of his unit north towards safety. But impossible for a different reason. Because Brennan was the radio operator for an entire battalion. 600 men. Spread across 3 miles of forest, divided into defensive positions that no longer had direct communication with each other. When the German offensive had started 3 days earlier, the attack had severed communication lines, field telephones, dead. Runners, too slow and too dangerous in contested territory. The only link between battalion command and the forward companies was Brennan's radio. A SCR 300 backpack radio, 35 pounds, 5-mile range. The lifeline that let scattered units coordinate, call for support, request ammunition, report enemy movements. If Brennan left, that lifeline was cut. The battalion commander, Major Harrison, had made the decision to evacuate headquarters 2 hours earlier. German armor was less than a mile away. Artillery was already hitting the edges of their position. Staying meant being overrun, captured, or killed. So Harrison had ordered everyone out, including Brennan. But Harrison hadn't considered something critical. That Brennan's radio wasn't just equipment. It was the central nervous system of the entire battalion. Without it, the forward companies would be isolated, unable to coordinate, unable to call for artillery support, unable to request withdrawal permission. They'd be tactically blind, fighting alone against an enemy they couldn't track or predict. And they'd die. Not all of them, but enough. Brennan looked at the evacuation order again, then at his radio, then at the map showing battalion positions. 6 companies, Alpha through Foxtrot, all of them marked on the map, all of them depending on communication that only his radio could provide. Brennan made a decision that no training had prepared him for. He tore up the evacuation order, dropped the pieces on the floor, and started transmitting. All companies, this is battalion radio. Headquarters evacuating, but radio net remaining operational. Maintain communication schedule. I'll coordinate from current position until further notice. The responses came back immediately. Roger, battalion radio. Copy that. Understood. They didn't ask why headquarters was evacuating, but the radio was staying. They just knew that as long as Brennan was transmitting, they weren't alone. What Brennan didn't know yet, what he couldn't have predicted, was that his decision to stay behind would turn a chaotic retreat into an organized withdrawal. That his voice on the radio would become the anchor point that held a scattered battalion together. And that the next 18 hours would test not just his courage, but his understanding of what duty meant when following orders meant abandoning the people who needed you most. Who was James Brennan? James Patrick. Brennan was born in 1922 in Chicago, Illinois. South Side. Working-class Irish neighborhood where everyone knew everyone else's business. His father was a telephone lineman, worked for the Bell system, climbing poles, stringing wires, connecting houses to the network that let people talk to each other across distances. James grew up understanding that communication was invisible, but essential. That when phones worked, people took it for granted. But when they didn't, everything stopped. His father would come home with stories about emergency repairs, storms that knocked down hundreds of lines, working through the night to restore service to hospitals, police stations, critical facilities. People don't see us, his father would say. But they need us. James learned that some jobs weren't about glory. They were about being the connection that let other people do their jobs. By age 16, James was working with his father during summer breaks, learning how communication systems worked, how signals traveled, how to troubleshoot when they didn't. When the war started, James enlisted in the Signal Corps. Told the recruiter he knew communication systems. They tested him. Electrical theory, good. Radio operation, excellent. Problem solving under pressure, exceptional. He was assigned to radio operations school. 6 months of training on military radio equipment, Morse code, voice transmission, frequency management, field repairs. And one lesson that stuck with James more than any other: your job is to maintain communication, no matter what. Because without communication, units can't coordinate, artillery can't provide support, commands can't direct operations. Communication is everything. James took that seriously. By December 1944, he'd been deployed to Europe for 8 months, assigned as battalion radio operator. Not a glamorous position, not even particularly dangerous most of the time, just essential. James sat in the communications bunker every day, maintaining radio schedules, relaying messages between companies, coordinating with artillery units, passing intelligence up the chain. It was routine work, critical work, but routine. Until December 16th, 1944, when the Germans launched their surprise winter offensive, the Battle of the Bulge. Suddenly, everything changed. Communication lines were cut, units were scattered, command structure was disrupted, and James's radio became the only link holding a fragmenting battalion together. What James didn't know, what he'd only realized later, was that his father's lessons about being the invisible connection were about to be tested in the most extreme way possible. Not in peacetime, not with telephones and routine repairs, but in combat, where staying connected meant staying alive. The battalion that couldn't retreat. The 2nd Battalion had been holding a defensive sector in the Ardennes forest for 6 weeks. Quiet sector. Minimal enemy contact. Good place for units to rest and refit after heavy fighting further north. That's what command had thought. But the Germans had other plans. On December 16th, they launched the largest counteroffensive of the war. Over 200,000 troops, tanks, artillery, all of it smashing into the quiet Ardennes sector. American units were overwhelmed, not because they fought poorly, but because they were outnumbered and outgunned. The 2nd Battalion found itself in the path of a German armored division. Orders came down to withdraw, fall back to secondary defensive positions, delay the Germans, but don't get surrounded. Simple orders, but impossible to execute in the chaos. The German attack had cut communication lines, field telephone wires severed by artillery, runners getting killed or captured trying to move between positions. The 6 companies of the battalion, Alpha through Foxtrot, were scattered across 3 miles of snow-covered forest, each company fighting its own battle, trying to withdraw but not knowing where the other companies were, not knowing if their flanks were covered, not knowing if they were retreating into German positions or toward friendly lines. Battalion Command, Major Harrison and his staff, tried to coordinate, but without communication, it was impossible. They couldn't tell Alpha Company to cover Bravo's withdrawal, couldn't tell Charlie Company that Delta was already pulling back, couldn't coordinate artillery support because forward observers couldn't report enemy positions. The battalion was fragmenting, each company making its own decisions, some withdrawing too fast, others holding too long, all of them at risk of being cut off and destroyed. That's when James Brennan's radio became the difference between an organized withdrawal and a massacre. Because James was the only person who could talk to all 6 companies simultaneously. The only person who could see the complete picture of where everyone was. The only person who could coordinate movement, so companies didn't abandon each other. And on December 23rd, when headquarters received the order to evacuate, James realized that if he left, all of that ended. The battalion would be tactically blind, and men would die because nobody was connecting them anymore. So James stayed. What he didn't know, what he couldn't have anticipated, was that staying behind would turn him into something he'd never intended to be. Not just a radio operator, but the command node that held an entire battalion together when everything else had failed. The first hours alone. By 1400 hours on December 23rd, the headquarters staff had evacuated. Major Harrison, the operations officer, the intelligence section, all of them moving north toward the new command post, being established 5 miles away. James was alone in the bunker, just him and his radio. The bunker was a reinforced dugout, logs and sandbags, small wood stove that barely kept the temperature above freezing. One entrance, one small window for the radio antenna. It had been built for a crew of 4. Now it was just James. He checked his supplies, radio batteries, enough for maybe 36 hours of continuous operation. Food, 3 days of K rations. Water, 2 canteens plus melted snow. Ammunition, 1 carbine rifle with 2 magazines. Not a lot, but enough, if he was careful. The first transmission came at 14 on 20 hours. Battalion radio, this is Alpha 6. Request artillery support. Enemy armor approaching our position. James switched channels, called the artillery liaison. Fire mission, Alpha Company sector. Enemy armor, fire for effect. The artillery responded within minutes. James relayed the fire commands back to Alpha Company. Adjusted fire based on their reports. The armor withdrew. Alpha Company held. Crisis averted. But it was just the first one. At 14:45 hours, Bravo Company reported they were being flanked, requested permission to withdraw. James checked the map. If Bravo withdrew now, they'd expose Charlie Company's left flank. Bravo 6, hold current position for 30 minutes. Charlie is pulling back to cover you. Then you can withdraw. Roger. Battalion radio. James called Charlie Company. Charlie 6, Bravo is holding to cover your withdrawal. You have 30 minutes to pull back to secondary positions. Copy that. For the next hour, James coordinated 6 companies withdrawing in sequence, each one covering the next. No one left exposed. No one abandoned. It was like conducting an orchestra. Each company a different instrument. James keeping them in rhythm, making sure they moved together. By 1600 hours, all 6 companies had successfully withdrawn to their secondary positions. 0 casualties during the movement. Perfect execution. Alpha Company commander came on the radio. Battalion radio, that was the smoothest withdrawal I've ever seen. Who's coordinating? James hesitated. Then, just following the plan, Alpha 6. He didn't mention that he was alone. Didn't mention that headquarters had evacuated, because that information would undermine confidence, would make them think they were abandoned. So James kept transmitting as if everything was normal, as if headquarters was still there, as if he wasn't sitting alone in a bunker that would be overrun by Germans within hours. What James didn't know, what he'd only learned later, was that his coordination had saved not just individual companies, but the entire battalion's cohesion. By keeping them connected, by maintaining the command structure even when physical command had evacuated, James had prevented the fragmentation that destroyed other units during the Bulge. The Germans arrive at 1800 hours. James heard the first sounds of German vehicles. Distant, but getting closer. Engines, tracks on snow, voices shouting in German. The evacuation order had been correct. German forces were advancing through this sector, and James was directly in their path. He reduced his transmission power. Lower power meant shorter range, but also less chance of the Germans detecting his signal and triangulating his position. He could still reach all 6 companies. Barely. But they could hear him. and that's all that mattered. At 1830 hours, Delta Company reported enemy contact. Battalion radio, Delta 6. German infantry probing our positions. Estimate company strength. James checked the map. Delta was on the eastern flank. Most exposed position. Delta 6, can you hold? Affirmative. But we need to know if anyone's on our right flank. James knew there wasn't. The unit that had been on Delta's right had withdrawn hours earlier. Delta was alone. Delta 6, your right flank is open. Recommend defensive posture. Do not advance. Roger. At 1900 hours, James heard the Germans much closer now. Maybe half a mile. He turned off the wood stove. Didn't want smoke giving away his position. The bunker went cold. Fast. But James kept transmitting. At 1930 hours, Echo Company called in. Battalion radio, Echo 6. Taking mortar fire. Heavy casualties. Request permission to withdraw. James checked the withdrawal plan. Echo was supposed to hold until midnight to cover Foxtrot's movement. But if they were taking casualties, holding might mean losing the entire company. Decision time. James made it the way he'd made every decision that day, based on what kept the most men alive. Echo 6, withdraw immediately. Foxtrot will cover your movement. He called Foxtrot. Foxtrot 6, Echo is withdrawing under fire. Extend your right flank to cover them. Roger. Battalion radio. The withdrawal succeeded. Echo got out. 20 casualties. But the company stayed intact. Foxtrot covered them. No one got surrounded. At 2000 hours, James heard German voices outside the bunker. Close. Very close. Maybe 50 yards. He turned down the radio volume, whispered into the microphone. All stations, battalion radio going dark for 1 hour. Maintain defensive positions. We'll resume transmission schedule at 2100. He shut down the radio, sat in complete darkness. Listening. German patrol moving through the area, searching, looking for American positions. James sat perfectly still, carbine across his lap. Ready. If they found him, he'd fight. But fighting meant the transmission ended permanently. So James hoped they wouldn't find him. 30 minutes passed. The German voices faded, moved past. James waited another 30 minutes, then powered up the radio. All stations, battalion radio resuming operations. The responses came back immediately. Feuilleton, evident in their voices. Roger. Battalion radio. Good to hear you. They'd thought he was gone, that they were alone. But James was still there, still transmitting, still connecting them. What James didn't know, what no one could tell him, was that his presence on the radio was doing more than coordinating tactics. It was providing something psychological, the knowledge that someone was still there, still watching, still caring whether they lived or died. In the chaos of the Bulge, that mattered more than anyone realized. The longest night. James operated through the night, coordinating 6 companies as they continued to withdraw, calling artillery when German forces pressed too close, relaying intelligence about enemy movements, maintaining the rhythm that kept them moving together. By midnight, all 6 companies had reached their final defensive positions, 5 miles back from where they'd started. Still intact, still organized, still fighting as a cohesive unit. Battalion casualties for the day. 48 wounded, 7 killed. Terrible numbers, but far better than it could have been. Other battalions in the sector had been completely destroyed, surrounded, captured, or scattered so badly they ceased to exist as fighting units. 2nd Battalion was still together, still combat effective, because one radio operator had stayed behind. At 0200 hours, James received a transmission on a different frequency. Not from one of his companies, from the new battalion headquarters. Major Harrison's voice. Battalion radio, this is Harrison. What is your status? James hesitated. Then, all companies successfully withdrawn to final positions. Casualties moderate. Unit cohesion maintained. Where are you transmitting from? James looked around the bunker. Cold. Dark. Behind enemy lines now. Original position, sir. Silence. Then, you were ordered to evacuate. Yes, sir. But companies needed communication support during withdrawal. Maintained radio net to coordinate movement. Another silence. Longer. Understood. Can you reach friendly lines? James thought about it. The Germans were between him and the new positions, moving through at night, alone, through enemy-held territory. The odds weren't good. Negative, sir. Position compromised. We'll maintain radio operations until batteries expire or position overrun. How long on batteries? James checked. Maybe 12 hours. We're sending a patrol to extract you. Negative, sir. Too dangerous. Don't risk men for one radio operator. Brennan. Sir, I can do more good here than I could escaping. I can still coordinate. Still call fire missions. Still connect companies. Let me stay until the radio dies. Harrison was quiet. Then, understood. Stay safe, Corporal. Will do, sir. James sat back. 12 more hours. Then the batteries would be dead. And he'd have to decide whether to try escaping through enemy lines or stay and be captured. But that was a problem for later. Right now, he had 12 hours of radio operation left, and 6 companies that still needed him. So James kept transmitting. The final transmission. By dawn on December 24th, James's batteries were nearly dead. Radio power fading. Range shrinking. He could barely reach the companies anymore. But he kept trying. At 800 hours, Alpha Company reported enemy armor moving toward their position. James called for artillery, but his signal was so weak the fire direction center could barely hear him. He repeated the coordinates 3 times, finally got confirmation. Artillery fire landed. Enemy armor withdrew. Alpha Company held. At 0900 hours, the radio stopped transmitting entirely. Batteries dead. James sat in silence. For the first time in 18 hours, no voices, no static, just quiet. He'd done everything he could. Coordinated the entire withdrawal. Kept 6 companies connected. Called fire missions that saved lives. Maintained battalion cohesion when everything else had collapsed. Now it was over. James packed his gear, what little he had, then sat down to wait for the Germans to find him, or for darkness to try escaping. At 1000 hours, he heard engines again. American engines. Jeeps. James looked through the window. 3 jeeps. American markings. Infantry dismounting, moving carefully toward the bunker. James stood in the doorway, hands visible. "Don't shoot! American!" The patrol leader approached. Lieutenant from Alpha Company. "Corporal Brennan?" "Yes, sir." "Major Harrison sent us. You're being extracted." "Sir, I told him not to risk." "Harrison said you'd say that. He also said we're not leaving without you. So let's go." James grabbed his gear, followed them to the jeeps. As they drove north, the lieutenant turned to him. "You know the entire battalion is talking about you." "Sir?" "You stayed behind, coordinated the whole withdrawal, kept us connected when everything was falling apart. You saved a lot of lives." James didn't know how to respond. "Just did my job, sir." "Yeah," the lieutenant said. "But you did it when everyone else had left. That's different." They reached the new battalion headquarters by noon. Major Harrison was waiting. "Corporal Brennan." "Sir." Harrison studied him. "You disobeyed a direct order." "Yes, sir." "Stayed in an exposed position for 18 hours." "Yes, sir." "Coordinated an entire battalion withdrawal by yourself." "Yes, sir." Harrison was quiet. Then, "I should court-martial you." James said nothing. "But I'm not." Because what you did was exactly what needed to be done. You saw that companies needed communication support, and you provided it, even when it meant staying behind. Harrison extended his hand. Thank you, Corporal. James shook it. Just did what made sense, sir. That's all any of us can do. What Harrison didn't say, what James wouldn't learn for weeks, was that 2nd Battalion's withdrawal had been one of the most successful in the entire sector. While other units had been destroyed, 2nd Battalion had withdrawn intact, combat effective, ready to fight again. All because one radio operator had stayed connected. The operator, who understood connection. James Brennan stayed in the Army until 1946, continued as a radio operator until the war ended, returned to Chicago in August of that year. He could have gone back to telephone work, following his father's footsteps. But something had changed. James had learned that communication wasn't just about technology. It was about being the link that held people together when everything else failed. He went to college on the GI Bill, studied communications engineering, then joined AT&T, working on long-distance telephone systems, not the physical lines like his father, but the switching systems, the networks that connected entire regions. James spent 38 years at AT&T, designing communication networks that could survive disruptions, that had redundancy, that kept working even when parts of the system failed. He never talked about the war, never mentioned staying behind in the bunker, but his work showed that he understood something fundamental. That connection mattered, that when people were isolated, they made worse decisions. But when they were connected, they could coordinate, could support each other, could survive things they couldn't survive alone. James retired in 1984, died in 2001, age 79. His obituary mentioned his career at AT&T, his contributions to telecommunications. One sentence mentioned his military service. Served as radio operator, U.S. Army Signal Corps, World War II. That was all. No mention of the 18 hours. No mention of the battalion he kept connected. No mention of the withdrawal he coordinated alone. But in Signal Corps training materials, James's actions are still referenced, not as heroism, but as professional excellence. Understanding your mission deeply enough to know when staying mattered more than surviving. The link that saved a battalion. Today, military communications are digital, satellite links, encrypted networks, redundant systems that can't be easily disrupted. But the principle James Brennan understood remains the same. Communication is what holds military units together. Without it, coordinated action is impossible. Without it, units fragment. Make independent decisions that don't account for the larger picture. Without it, people die not because they're outfought, but because they're isolated. Every Signal Corps soldier who's deployed since World War II has been taught the same lesson James learned in that bunker. That your job isn't just operating equipment, it's maintaining the connection that lets everyone else do their jobs. And sometimes, maintaining that connection means staying when everyone else leaves. James Brennan disobeyed orders, stayed behind in an exposed position, risked capture or death, all to keep a radio transmitting. That's not heroism in the traditional sense. It's something quieter, more essential. The understanding that some jobs aren't about saving yourself. They're about being the link that saves everyone else. James did that. For 18 hours, in a freezing bunker, behind enemy lines, with batteries slowly dying. And in doing so, he proved something fundamental. That courage isn't always about charging forward. Sometimes it's about staying behind, being the voice on the radio that tells scattered people they're not alone, that someone is still there, still watching, still connecting them. That's what James Brennan did. And that's why 600 men made it home from a battle they shouldn't have survived. Because one radio operator refused to leave until everyone else was safe.